Chapter 28. Waiting for dismissal from the breakfast table felt untenable. Zelda ticked off the steps comprising the routine before they typically parted for the day. The king off to calculate incoming fortunes and subtly adjust his forces, and her to whatever innocuous tasks were set upon her sparse plate. Scraps, she suddenly realized, bitter with clandestine fury. Jumps staged around her arena, the occasional hoop held aloft, a smattering of congratulations in a sideshow he only half watched to humor her. He'd surely known how excited she would be to embrace all those tiny tasks he set her out upon, funneling her enthusiasm and care away into the long, cold winter, only to emerge ripe and ready for spring. Drawn into the trap by her curiosity and eagerness just as she'd followed the lure into his resurrection 7 years before. Such a simple, predictable creature. She was little more than her puppet visage unleashed to confound Hyrule in her upheaval absence. Coffee empty, a tidy stack of sealed envelopes set beside him. The day's handwritten schedule slipped into his view by one of the Verena. Check, check, check. She grasped the arms of the dining chair, ready to depart as she always did, out to find a safe enough place to breathe and come up with something, anything. A delay, a distraction, some clever way of nudging the Demon King off track. She couldn't think it all here with the chilling ruby throbbing at her jugular, feeding off of the racing disquiet in her heart like a parasite. She tilted her head toward hallway doors escape, only to watch as one of the staff reappeared through them. They curled around the long table to Ganondorf's side, delivering a silver tray. The king spread the finished paper across his setting, and the servant set down the offering, which Zelda could now see held 5 freshly sharpened red pencils. He took an agonizing age to indent circles into the paper, snapping off the tips of the perfect instruments as he underlined passages that would need more attention. She hovered, pitched on the edge of the chair, unsure if he even desired her to stay.
"Excuse me,"
she called out to the encroaching servant.
"Can you tell Audrina to prepare the horses? I'd like to revisit the Temple of Time today. There will be no riding today. The horses will remain in the stable."
He overrode her without looking up, waving the servant away with a dismissive flick of his fingers in their general direction. She couldn't help the small rise of her voice's pitch, squeaking out as if being squeezed.
"I wouldn't be long,"
she pushed sweetly.
"We can ride as the crow flies, if you wish me back faster than what the roads will allow. You know Audrina and the others always keep me safe. The Gazette has been delivered to every stable, pub, and doorstep in central Hyrule to a populace left waiting for 3 days on news of a fate they were too poor and insignificant to attend,"
he said, his tone lilting with a chuckle.
"Everyone within a stone's throw of the gates knows our little secret by now. We can't have you seen recklessly galloping off on horseback." "Of course. How foolish of me,"
she smiled, gritting her teeth as he continued making notes in the margins, writing her story just like the prophetic murals sealing her fate deep below.
"A walk then? Lena and Audrina have been stuck within these walls as well for quite a stretch. I'm sure they'd enjoy a respite outside the gates. Lookout Landing Park should be quiet this time of day. And have the disgusting masses swarming you up close, and realize that you may not be as plump and luminous as this paints you? You're going to have to stomp out that restless street, pet,"
he noted, perhaps scrawling it as a reminder alongside all of his other ideas. She wouldn't doubt it.
"Your place is here."
She clasped her hands in her lap, wrenching her nails against her flexed knuckle bone.
"It's a fragile situation,"
she murmured, referring to everything and nothing, phantom echoes of her will. He folded the marked-up newspaper back along its pleats, tucking it beneath the schedule. A review with Tracy and pen was no doubt part of the long list.
"I will be occupied most of the day,"
he said, glancing over the docket.
"The Zoras are back with reports already. How tiresome. They'd better pray to their plankton gods that they make it worth my while. It was bad enough at the ball, having to listen to that sniveling drone king go over every loyalist he'd rooted out, like he wanted a door prize."
She nodded reflexively, the swath of her remaining existence spreading below her like the ground before a fall. She'd be nothing but a vessel to pour all of the obligations, frustrations, expectations, and grievances another way of satisfying his endless discontent. Nothing she was before or promised to do would matter again. It would not be remembered when she was gone. As long as she delivered his screaming, all-encompassing legacy, her blood siphoned instead of spilled, that would be the only thing that ever mattered until she was recused, emptied and moldering, reclaimed by the goddess's curse.
"There's a mass of gifts down in the library,"
he said, still lost in the list of his commitment.
"Offerings and trinkets brought in as tribute by our esteemed guests. The Rita girls are sorting through them. You can offer your voice to the correspondence until tea. It would be good to get a start on it now, as I expect more will start rolling in shortly."
Dictate thank you notes. So flowery as to be noxious. She accepted the poison, trailing the expanse of his shoulder as she passed behind, pressing a kiss to the crown of his head. A guard waited at the door, ready to shuttle her from one prison to the next. The tallest trees in Mishni Woods were just beginning to scrape their silhouettes against the waning sun. If Link had to be generous, it was maybe 3 in the afternoon. Still hours until sunset. An impossibly long day, with nothing to do or ponder but the wait for the slightest tremor of evidence that Riju's vow was hers to make, that Hyrule would dare to defy its conqueror. The copper taste of blood had already seeped through his gums. The scar tissue inside of his cheek gnawed raw again as he stood amongst the motionless guards and gurgling fountain and brimming floral statuary. Useless. For these last days he felt as though he was planting his feet in 2 separate realities, unsure of which he wished to land. One minute he fantasized about sneaking down to the stable and stealing one of the Gerudo horses, running the creature ragged until they reached the desert. Call it off, all of it, he'd tell Riju. If they blazed ahead with this plan, Pure would be livid. This was impulsive. It betrayed all the rules she carefully set down from on high. He had no plan for what to do once the gates were sieged, nothing save find her. But then his hands prickled with the ball sensation of Zelda's softness against him, the weight of her breath and bone, her favorite lavender and honey wafting from her spill of hair, her flail of limbs. A minute, maybe, that had sparked in him like flint to kerosene. It made him heady with greed, imagining her face beholding his own, melting the tightly wound illusion of Queen Zelda from the depths from which it spawned, cracking away to reveal his princess. It was then, drunk on his rapacity, that he'd let Riju's impatience brush off Pura's warnings. Yes, of course they needed to rise up now. After all, what had this deluge of time secured them? A better vista to watch her suffering? The longer he stayed here amongst the ranks, the more likely he'd be caught in a slip and doom them all. This was the only viable strategy. Surely. His lurching thoughts lifted with the blessed sound of the library doors opening, the shadow of Zelda's figure cutting through the light. He'd scarcely had time to luxuriate in the relief at seeing her again, for the first time since the ball, before an anchor of dread plummeted his heart into his stomach. Something was wrong. It was clear from the instant the doors latched behind her, and she stumbled down the landing into the courtyard. Her hands raked through her golden hair, yanked loose from its usual plaits and twists, her breathing heavy and as loud as a voice as she crossed, then crossed again, zigzagging in thoughtless, pointless paces. Her erratic gait flew from one end of the patio only to halt at another, as she ground her fists into her temples. He watched, his arms twitching to reach out, to catch her once more, as she accidentally bumped into the tea tray that had been left out by the staff an hour before. It rattled on the iron table, catching her attention. She peered down at the tightly cut triangles stuffed with hearty salmon and egg salad, the color draining from her face. She lurched forward, desperate to reach the edge, barely making the 6 paces to the railing before the vomit erupted over the cliff, splattering the rocks and moat below. He could reach her. All he had to do was stretch his arm, and that silken sleeve would be between his fingertips. Her sickened, troubled body curled up in her arms as he held her, rocked her gently, drew her hand up and down her back to coax the trouble away.
"Shit,"
Link heard Cleet mutter from his opposite flank.
"It's actually true."
Zelda pried herself up from the rail at arm's length, wiping the muck from her lips on the sleeve of her kimono, sunken black once again. She staggered a bit, the way she did after one too many ciders, punchy and slurring. It was cute then, the way she'd get indignant about misclassified lizards in a textbook, ranting until he cajoled her up to bed. Not this, not the kind of upset souring her insides and sending her mind reeling like a wheel knocked loose from its axle.
Say that again, soldier,
she ordered, crossing Link to stand at Cleet's toes.
Ah. Louder, so all your little friends can hear you,
she demanded, the tip of her nose pressing right up against his mask.
You want to know all the real gossip, don't you? A tale you can spill at the pub for an extra morsel of attention tonight? Ask me. Is it true what the paper said?
He whispered, so slight that Link himself barely caught it on the crosswind. She stood back, her hands on her hips, her lips pursed.
So demure now, are we? From the looks of things, I don't think all of your friends have yet received their copy of the Lucky Clover Gazette today. So it looks like you get to be the bearer of the big scoop.
The paper? Most days Link found Zelda's deserted copy tucked beneath her tea tray after she'd left, preferring to take his propaganda with dinner. Either that, or he just absorbed the uncut gossip from Marina, who hadn't been spotted yet this afternoon. She stepped back, gesturing to the dissipated crowd, raising her voice up to hit the distant guardhouse.
So please, for everyone, what truth did you want to know about Queen Zelda?
He stammered, and Link could hear the rattling of his sheath against his belt.
Your Highness, your Supreme Majesty, do you know if it's your Zelda?
The voice pierced across from the library doors, an entrance none of them had noticed in the thick of her outburst. 4 of the Varina flanked their commander, the one they called Lena, whose ruby ponytail clip had been upgraded through the spring into what looked like a proper tiara at this point. To her right, a woman distinguishable by a golden bow, which, unsheathed from her back, was almost the same height as its wielder. Lena stepped down, punctuating each stare with her spear.
The king wishes to speak with you.
The queen whirled around, balling her hands.
I'll be up later,
she said, her voice unusually short.
This can't wait,
Lena said, continuing their advance without so much as a hesitation in their gait.
It's going to have to,
Zelda cried out.
I'm not going in there until I'm done. Damn it. Tell him to go down to the stable if he wants to trot out his show horse.
The archer and her commander soared down the steps, snatching Zelda by the arms, a fluid and practiced motion they'd likely been conjuring in their imaginations for the better part of the year. Too fast and immaculate for the queen to react until she was thrashing in the trap, the flimsy silk of the robe slipping down her shoulders in the struggle.
Your pitiful excuses are no good today, or vain,
Lena sneered, stating the harsh consonants in an insult Link had only heard mentioned in theory, not hurled in practice.
You have no right to treat me like this,
Zelda cried, kicking her slippers in rage, a futile gesture that didn't even grant her the dignity of rousing a sound. Every last muscle in his body thrummed with the need to cleave the Varina's arms off, to fight each soldier remaining on the patio, make a break for the stables and outrun the gates, the arrows, to do the one thing he'd ever been trained to do, the singular imperative that had given any sense of purpose to his life. Go to her, they slit her throat. Let her go, they may not slit her throat before sunset. We only have to wait until sunset. They were so close. Too close to die with the taste of deliverance on their lips. He won't kill me. Her words, spoken with such firm confidence in the ruins of their home, on the threshold of their shattering hell, the so far proven fact that had kept him repressing the constant urge to speak her name and draw his blade at the slightest frisson of threat. Because he'll need me to get to you. And now that he was dead, what promise kept him bound to this unnatural pretense, this betrayal of his very nature? What was left of her influence, her leverage, to keep her safe?
If I have to hear another word out of your mouth, I'll take whatever punishment the king determines for carving out your tongue,"
she said, ushering the women forward with a flick of her hand. On the Verena's heels back into the bowels of the castle, the Yiga commander appeared among them, flustered and unsure where to focus, the inverse of his precision counterpart and their queen-neutralizing super strike.
"Boys, soldiers, men, gather up at once. This is an emergency situation."
He jumped up on the lip of the fountain, not noticing as the spray soaked his pleated collar, dissolving the starch. It sagged like a bib around his neck as he spoke, all this time holed up in the guardhouse, rotting on cake's nail, stumbling on his left feet to summon his command while he waved his arms incredulously. The guards, craning their necks about to behold one another, tentatively advanced.
"There is an unprecedented report out of Zora's domain that we're coming under attack, and that forces are going to have their aims on breaching the gates and overthrowing the throne. It's bad,"
he muttered, sifting through the revelation aloud.
"So many random patrols took off to help make sure the guests got back home securely. They're still on their way back here. They don't know."
He straightened, remembering himself, raising his voice to a shout to reclaim his authority by sheer force of volume.
"New castle town gates are going to be breached. There's no getting around that. Let them tear through the useless village as hard as they want. Maybe some good looting and pillaging by the townsfolk once they catch on to the chaos will slow the invading bastards down. We'll pull all our forces off the bridge and streets and bring them up to the castle gates. I need all of you in the entrance and sanctum. Whatever we do, we can't let them breach the east wing. Do you idiots understand?"
The tower. King Rome's former chamber. That must be where the Verena were headed with their hostage. It was only accessible from a single winding staircase off the dining hall and library passages, wholly removed from the sanctum. An independent steeple that was difficult to pinpoint from all of the identical hallways and chamber doors. The perfect place to sequester the king and queen from those who would seek to extract her. A confused cheer rose from the small crowd as they began jogging into the library, let loose in the halls at long last. Against their tide, the servants were already running and screaming at each other, echoing the panic in their clipped directions.
"Meet in the East Gate Tower."
And,
"Hurry. You can already see them from the observation deck."
Their arms full of the kitchen silver and the closet textiles, Link's body followed along, his head thrashing to catch up. Zora's domain, where the leak had emerged, was steeped with the people the most anxious of all the four corners of Hyrule for vengeance, for what the Demon King had taken from them. Except Rieju's emissary would have known not to go to the puppet king installed after Sidon's murder. She'd have clear instructions for who was sympathetic to the royal family in Old Hyrule. But even a puppet would have power with a crown, and eyes and ears enough to seep into his own fiefdom. And following the easy valley roads of South Akala and Eldin made the journey from the domain's heart to Hyrule Castle's gates one of the least encumbered in all of Hyrule. The fastest speeding horse would only need a matter of hours to betray the coming onslaught with the faint whisper of betrayal. If they'd have talked it through, met up at the Eldin Research Lab, vertical addition to poke these holes into Rieju's credence, realized the liabilities, the dangers of including their beloved but compromised allies to the east. But instead, he'd tumbled headfirst into the reverie of freedom, burning the delicate framework they'd all set together like stars streaking through the night sky to crater the earth below. Instead of bringing Zelda back to his arms, he'd catapulted her back up into the tower, as good as set the lock on Ganondorf's fortune and leverage with his own stupid, overeager hands. His feet continued marching forward, servants and guards and soldiers nearly colliding into one another across and down, and through the halls in unfettered disarray. And yet his body kept onward, straight into the castle's core. No one, he realized, was watching him. The commander had disappeared as quickly as he'd arrived, perhaps to oversee the sanctum defense, maybe to conveniently resign into the cloaked depths. As far as the brethren was concerned, this was every man for himself. Link slid up against the passage wall, and was at once furniture, nothing but a backdrop in the blur of everyone else's self-preservation. One single spire, one well-guarded, but not impervious, chamber. Find her. Sunset was imminent, and in its wake, whether fated for the princess or the underworld, the goddess's final design would claim his soul. Clutching his scoundrel's blade, Link turned from the current to march straight toward the reckoning. End of chapter.